Hello and welcome to Verum Fabula Fellowship Podcast. I'm Wes Mullins.
And I'm Randy Hardman, and we will be your hosts today. It is our goal to bring you content that cultivates and enriches your daily interactions and encourages the refinement of character and intellect. The terrain we cover ranges from literature to philosophy to theology. It is our hope that through these lenses we can offer insight to the human experience and the human condition that is empowering and transformative.
Verum Fabula Fellowship is located in the beautiful town of Wilmore, Kentucky, and the podcast takes place at Drinkling's Roastery on Main Street. This is also where the fellowship meets regularly and where members are encouraged to present new thoughts and ideas, engage with interesting and important topics in discussion seminars, and interact with and listen to keynote speakers invited in to challenge us intellectually and spiritually. It is a true intellectual collective. Please rate this podcast on iTunes, and if we've said things that are helpful, be sure to tell your Lewis and Tolkien friends about us. With no more ado, here we go. Further up and further in. Hello and welcome to Verum Fabula Fellowship Review. This is the Jack and Beren Show. I'm Wes Mullins.
And I'm Randy Hardman.
Today we're going to be discussing something that is meaty, in-depth, rich, and for Randy, it's what he loves.
I'm a Tolkien guy.
He's a Tolkien guy, so it's right up his alley. So why don't you go ahead and open it up for us?
Yeah. So there's this little obscure book that we kind of pulled from. I only ran across it a few years ago. Tales from the Perilous Realm.
Love the title.
Yeah, it's a great title. I think that's one of those things with Tolkien. So many people kind of don't realize that there's just a treasure trove of other stuff beyond his Hobbit and Lord of the Rings and, stuff like that. And a lot of it's just like, those were the ones that were published, but he has a whole lot of other things that have just, even really come out just within the past couple of years. I think, like this, one of the stories in here is called Referendum. It was finally published in 1998. We got Leaf by Niggle, of course, that we did. But it got this little essay in the back, which is called On Fairie Stories. And we kind of just threw that out there to the group about the possibility of just spending some time, after doing just such deep theology for a while. We spent some time with man's search for meaning and just some other stuff, and to kind of just foray into something like fairy tales, right, and folklore can kind of just be a little bit of a breath of fresh air, as far as I'm concerned. But we started this off with looking, of course, at like the master of folklore and fairy tales, Tolkien. Kind of read more of an intellectual essay on that. I don't think that any of us really knew what to expect, because we put oftentimes Lewis and Tolkien kind of in the same camp, and there's so many different themes. But this was a hard essay. It was really good. But it's one of those where I'm like, I have now read this, and I'm going to want to reread this.
Yes. Because
every page, you can see, they can't see, but you can see, every page has like multiple underlinings, things on the side. So it's just like...
It's one that I will buy the book and I will annotate like crazy.
You want to go back to, because there's so much more than just a story, an essay on fairy tales.
Yeah, and now... I think this is good because we're setting the groundwork, and we have been for a while. We're setting the groundwork for our imaginations to be expanded beyond what they were, and we've brought in different types of reasoning. So we're creating the atmospheres, and we're expanding our consciousness in a sense. It's kind of what we've been doing, expanding our theology, so that when we're presented with these new stories, we don't automatically shut them down. Because some people will read like The Great Divorce and they'll be like, no, this is heretical, and they shut it down before they even get a chance to wrestle with the questions Lewis is bringing up. They shut it down on theological grounds.
Or like The Shack.
Yes, which I refused to read for decades because I thought it was heresy.
Yep.
Until Nina read it, and much to her credit, all to her credit, she says you have to read this.
Yeah.
we talk about things like this, and I read it one day. I sat
Yeah.
down and read the whole thing, and I was like, why was I so stupid
Yep.
that I didn't allow myself the opportunity to wrestle with these things like this? And so we've we've expanded the imagination, we've expanded the theology, we've expanded the reason, and now we're going to get into fairy tales.
Right.
And I think it's going to be amazing because we have so much to learn from myth.
Listen, man, like I come from that perspective where I am a hardline nonfiction reader. You know, if it is nonfiction, if it is fiction, it is pretty much Tolkien, you know, maybe
Right.
a little bit of Lewis, but outside of that, you know, there's nothing really else that has kind of satisfied me. And I think that's always troubled me in a certain way because I've never really been able to, like, explain why, other than, like, probably at a very gut level, I think that fiction is useless. You know? Nonfiction
You cut me to the core.
has ideas and it has thoughts and you can engage with it and you can do something with it. It's like a tool, right? And then fiction just seems like, I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, if you want to be entertained, but go watch the movie, get it done, 2.5 hours, you know, and get along your way and read something that's useful. And I think that's where, as I've kind of decided to spend the next 2 or 3 years just really saying, I want to read the good books. You know, I keep coming back to, like, what are the things that formed Lewis? What are the things that formed
Right.
Tolkien? And, I mean, these are masters of nonfiction kind of stuff. I mean, you're going to see all sorts of stuff all throughout their work that's, you know, Tolkien was a philologist, you know. Lewis was a literature scholar, but he read theology, he read science, you know, he read all of these kind of things. I mean, even Tolkien was, like, quoting stuff from philosophers, you know, that he had obviously had engagement with, and anthropologists and so forth. But one of the things that they have in common is that they read stories growing up. And that seems to have influenced not only their nonfiction work that they did and their academics and professional world, but it influenced their character and the things that we really appreciate about them.
That's why Lewis demanded a story from Tolkien about this new language, this Elvish language he'd come up with. Has to have a story.
Yeah.
And Tolkien said, I basically wrote Lord of the Rings to shut him up because he wouldn't lay off about a story. In which I think it's interesting that you mentioned escapism, because I have never ever seen fiction as escapism. So Jordan Peterson says that fiction is actually more real than reality.
Yeah.
It's hyper real. Because you can take a character and you can weave several personalities into a character. And so it's a composite character, and so when I'm watching a character, I can pick out and go, ooh, I resonate with that. I resonate with that. And in this fantastic essay, which I couldn't remember my point the other day when we were talking about it, but it's The Gods Return to Earth, JRR Tolkien, The Fellowship of the Ring, and it's Lewis. He talks about this book is lightning from a clear sky, talking about Lord of the Rings. But he goes on to talk about escapism, and he says that, well, let's see here, where am I at? He talks about that if you see a tree, if you see the white tree of Gondor, you see the Ents in the forest. When you see a tree in real life, it becomes more. As we read, we find ourselves sharing their burden, and when we have finished, we return to our own life, not relaxed, but fortified.
I like that, man.
Yeah, so he actually talks about escapism a lot in here, and I never go to a movie to escape.
Right.
I go to a movie to learn. I go to a movie, for me, I'm given this atmosphere that I can go into. It's kind of like modal logic. It's a possible world. And here are all the things I want to wrestle with in my life. And they're giving me this alternate reality.
Right.
To say, if we apply these principles and we do these things, this will be the outcome. So I get to see it play out modalistically and go, what can I learn from that?
Well, and that's it, is like recognizing that escape, you know, which is definitely a pejorative term, But Tolkien talks about escape. Fantasy and folklore and fairy tales is basically escape. And he says, one of the problems with modernity is that we've kind of given this pejorative. I think he calls it treachery. Escape. We have this idea that escapism is treachery from the real world. He says, no, listen, like when you actually have really good fairy tales, folklore, myths, all that kind of stuff, it's not that you're escaping from the real world. It's actually a matter of resistance to elements of the world that honestly need to be changed, but that think about Lord of the Rings, right? And you think about how much of that, it wasn't an allegory, the orcs were not Nazi soldiers and stuff like that, but there was definitely this, what he, called the machine, that was at play there. There was industrialism that was at play there. There was this idea of like losing nature and losing language and losing just simplicity and becoming caught up in this industrialism and this consumerism and this this progressivism kind of world. And he said, what fantasy and folklore can do is you're escaping actually to something as a response to what is actually occurring on. So no, it's not you checking out. Yeah. It's like music in a way, right? Of course, some people think, probably not as many, but some people think that music is escapist, right? And actually, I think most of your hip hop artists, your punk art, like a lot of that kind of stuff is like, it's prophetically critical of what is happening. It's prophetically reflective about what is happening in the world. It just does it in an artistic way.
Yeah,
so he just is like, escape actually is a good thing,
And I think some people do use literature and movies wrongly. They're like, oh, I can watch it. I can check out and watch this movie and check out. And to me, they're wasting, or they're like, I've already figured the movie out.
Yeah.
And they're like, this is going to happen, so... and they spend their time trying to figure the movie out. They're trying to figure the play out instead of allowing the author or allowing the characters to take them on a journey. And so I check out, in a sense, and escape into a movie going, okay, author, where do you want to take me? I'll go where you want to take me. Let's show me the path.
Right.
Whereas some people are like, they're trying to guess the whole time. And I'm like, no, the author has a reason why you're going down this road and why you're doing this.
And there's totally a difference between like being aware as you are engaging with something, and being vegging out on something. So I mean, even when you look at Lewis Tolkien and those kind of folks, like they saw, you want to go ask like Tolkien what he thought of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Right. He thought it was a complete crapshoot, and basically it was like, this is reduced now to, they take this awesome fairy tale and they reduce it now just to pure entertainment, down to the very bare bone, where it just doesn't mean anything, And so he's not saying like, hey, all art forms, whatever you can escape into, escapism is unilaterally good. Exactly. He's saying that if it is serving a positive utility function as a reflection in our culture, reflection of our society, reflection of ourselves, really that it has that moral element, then escapism actually really can be good.
It can, yeah. No, I absolutely agree. And I'm thinking, like one of my favorite movies on a topic like this is Stranger Than Fiction. Will Ferrell, Emma Thompson. I every time I watch it, I'm left just perplexed and pondering. I think that movie hits on a chord that is as an author, you're writing this character, and then you meet the character in real life, and then you decide the fate of that character once you've met them.
Yeah.
The responsibility the author has to create something and to be responsible with the resources in the world that he's created or she's created, that's not a light thing.
Nope.
Dickens used to cry every time one of his characters died. He would be depressed for days after one of his characters died. Because he brought this thing into life, and that's an echo to me of creation. And you're going through, and you're the Logos is speaking this world into existence, and you have these people, and how you treat them. I think there's almost a moral responsibility and how you treat the characters that you've created. And because people are going to be looking to this to escape into this world, and they're looking for you to be an honest narrator. They're looking for you to create a world that actually can help them make sense and find meaning in the real world. They can attribute those things, and so there's a responsibility to writing myth and fiction that's overlooked.
So let me ask you a question, because I even think Tolkien and Lewis had to at least at some point just kind of like, I said veg out, right?
Right.
We all reach our limits of just being able to like consciously think about it. Do you have something that you're like, you just sit down, kind of watch brainlessly?
Oh, absolutely.
Read brainlessly?
There are definitely things like that. One of the things that we watch is Elementary.
Okay. I haven't seen that.
It's Johnny Lee Miller. And so, yes, there are things that I sit down and veg out on, but what usually...
I love The Simpsons, so...
man.
Which has got smart humor in it, but it is still enough that I'm like, yeah, you know what, we all have our little our little things here and there.
And so even while I'm vegging out, sometimes my mind will go to some sort of philosophical issue that happens. I'm like, oh, right now Nina's binging Downton Abbey.
I can do that.
Julian Fellowes is just an incredible writer. He is undervalued as someone who can take a show about Victorian England where nothing like serious. I mean, I say that there are some big serious things that happen, but to take a house and create the mundane and give it tension that holds you was just impressive. What he can do as a writer, and I just think about how he makes you wrestle with moral quandaries.
Yeah,
and you're trying to veg out on it. You like the show, but then I find myself sliding away and going, what would I do in that situation?
Well, and that's one of those things, is if you can find a show that allows you to kind of rest and escape in a positive utility way at the same time, I think those are the shows that honestly like last for decades, I think of The Office, right? And
The Office.
I think The Office is, number one, it's satire on our world, so it is a reflection. It also allows us to kind of get out some of that like vocational angst, because we all see our own like bosses and our colleagues and our relationships and that kind of thing. But at the same time, it also allows you to just rest through that, And I think those are honestly the best kind of shows. And I think that's what when we're reading stuff like Lord of the Rings, right? So many of it, I mean, it's hard work, but it is also restful, at the same time. And there's a ton of books out there. I just started Victor Hugo, Les Miserables, right?
Wow.
And
okay.
I'm a little bit daunted by it. I think I'll get through it, but I don't think I'm going to get the kind of rest that I get with Tolkien. I'm not sure that I've ever met anybody that said they got rest from reading Les Miserables or Dostoevsky or something like that. There's not the enjoyment that's there, and I think that's the beauty of certain things. Is Narnia, it's just like you and fairy tales, that they are enjoyable.
Well, I think they hit on certain elements that are necessary for the rest. So what I think constitutes a book that has longevity is what I talk about all the time, is they have that synthesis of imagination and reason. They ignite your imagination enough to pull you in, and then it's reasonable enough for you to trust the narrator. And so that rest part you're talking about, if someone presents something and you don't trust the narrator, you spend the entire show not restful. Either one, you don't understand the narrator, the writer, or you're in contradiction with the narrator the whole time.
Yeah.
Going, this is not right. So that's not a very restful read. But if you can synthesize and create an imaginative world enough where people are like going, I'm drawn in, there's a call to adventure, there's this, and your heart is soaring, and then they ground that enough with enough reason for you to go, okay, I trust you, where are we going? You suspend your disbelief in that. And then if it can show you the three areas of prescriptive knowledge, which is how the world should be,
right.
Descriptive knowledge, how the world actually is, and then predictive knowledge, how the world can be or might be.
Right.
And it can put all those things together. Jordan Peterson says the reason why we have the great authors is because that's the best of us. That's the best of us can produce.
Right.
And I like that phrase because I think when you see it, Tolkien, he literally is the best fantasy writer in the history of the world. And you look at that, and take Doyle, the greatest mystery writer, created an entire genre out of nothing. And Tolkien did the same thing. He just creates this entire genre. And when you read it, he hits on all those levels. And no matter where you are, you can find yourself in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Dostoevsky, I don't know that you can. I don't know Anna Karenina. I don't know if you can find yourself in those stories. Jude the Obscure, the most depressing book I've ever read in my life. I hated every minute of it. It just ripped my heart out as I read and I was just going, I don't want to read stuff like this because it wasn't restful. It was work.
It's work.
Yeah.
Work. And that's okay. At certain points, I mean, The Shack, same kind of thing. I mean, you shouldn't love The Shack, you love The Shack, but you shouldn't love The Shack. Diary of Anne Frank, you shouldn't love that, but you do at the same time because of what it can give. And I don't know, I mean, it's just to show like this whole pursuit that we're kind of trying to do with this society is really just to broaden out what it is that we are really considering as good literature, Yeah. And I think just fantasy has gotten this bad rap. And I don't know how much of that is related to Disney and some of these places that kind of reduce it down. But,
you sterilized it.
Tolkien himself said, fantasy is a rational, not irrational activity. And
That's
he
brilliant.
Just flipped that on its head. And it allows us in a modern world which values science and math and business and economics to just really take that stuff and throw that in the camp of art and music and playwriting and all this kind of stuff that's like, even philosophy, like, that's kind of nice, but we don't really have room for creativity anymore unless it has some sort of economic impact. And I think that's a big critique of most of your good fantasy stuff is...
Well, a lot of it is written like Game of Thrones. Now, I'm going to be honest, I have not read a lot of Game of Thrones or any Terry Pratchett or any of those fantasy writers. But from the critique that I hear about them they borrow from Tolkien.
Oh, yeah.
But they miss the heart. They miss the essence of what Tolkien was getting at. And that's what I've heard from, and I don't know, you can maybe speak to that. And I see people writing fairy tales and fictions, and it is this sanitized version of, I don't even want to say truth. So if you get too much imagination, where he's like, it's not, if you get too much irrationality, well, as a human, I can't relate to it. I might find it fun, or might find it, like Oscar Wilde says, art for art's sake. Well, that's good if the rest of the art world around you is reasonable.
Yeah.
But if all art is art for art's sake, it loses the purpose and meaning of having art.
Yeah.
And so if I write a mythical story because I want to have dragons and swords and stuff like that, but there's no purpose for it, and it's just all imagination, and there's, or you go the other side of it and it's all formulaic. It's abstract formula, like it's looking at the Matrix all the time. Well, I can't relate to that either. And both of those are sterile because they can't procreate. They can't create anything inside of me. I think it was Sir Roger Scruton that said that basically literature is the blowing of the embers inside of you and trying to stoke them into a flame is what good literature is supposed to do.
Yeah.
And
I like that. And I even with a 2-year-old, man, like I sit here reading books, and I can tell the books that I like to read to him and the books that I do not like to read to him. And the ones that I do not like to read are the ones that are just about, trucks and balls and, or even these fantasy-ish kind of stories. But, it's like Baby's Day Out, kind of stories. And it's like, come on, But like I sat down today before nap and read I Love You, Stinky Face, right? And I'm like... Of course, it's mama, so I'm like, dada. But that's such, it's just as simple, but yet it is a completely different kind of children's book. And I'm like, even for me, it has nothing to do with the simplicity of that. it's not any more complex in the writing or the pictures or anything like that, but it is far more complex in what it is after to do, right? And I think most of us just recognize that. I mean, it's why most of us can only really take so much, just pop culture crap and, television. Seinfeld was its own kind of thing, but even that was a little bit of a reflection on culture, and we stand for deeper things. We want deeper things. And
yeah, because if you don't have anything deeper, what will help you find a meaning? And what we found in a hyper, so we had pre-modern classics, and you have these great works, Dante's Inferno, Paradise Lost, The Fairy Queen. You had Goethe with and
Dr.
Faustus, and you Lord Byron. You had all this just deep literature that makes you wrestle with the characters, and you have Lewis and Tolkien, and then you get this modern literature that comes out, William Forster, and you get some of his stuff and the postmodern stuff that comes out. And I found myself, even as an undergrad in literature class, I could not. I had a hard time reading the postmodern literature because it seemed soulless and empty and sterile, like a whited room. And you're like, oh, but look, there's this metaphor here, there's this, and I'm like, but what purpose? Like they have this great thing that happens, and then everything's taken away, and at the end, everybody dies. And you're like, wait, what was it for? What was the purpose? I missed the purpose. Like, oh, there is no purpose. And you're like,
well, I will say a guilty pleasure is I do love Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, even though it lands on the purpose of life is, what is it, 42 or something like that?
Yeah, 42.
That's the purpose of life. I was just like, but even there, again, like honestly, that stuff is still stuff to wrestle with. It's just a question of whether it's inviting you to, or if it's just trying to tell you, and or just leave you without much reflection on that.
And sometimes authors don't realize that they're even instinctually wrestling with good stuff, but then in a need to be witty or smart or undid all of their work that they were doing previously.
Oh, well, I mean, think about that. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the reason why I like it is because it's so random that it's humorous. And so I think in a way it is not conveying 42 is not necessarily the reason for the universe. It is like enjoyment, humor, all these things. It is in some sense conveying that there are important things beyond just nothingness that's there. And so it's all like there's little bits and pieces and devils in the details and stuff like that. But I think the big thing that I'm just pulling from all of this is, number one, we should appreciate what fantasy and what fairy stories and Tolkien. I just actually bought 2 of them just online because I thought, you know what, like George MacDonald, I've never read a whole lot of his stuff before, but obviously he was so influential as a fairy or folklorist, fairy story writer, that I want to pass along whatever it is that he's saying that these guys picked up, pass that into my kids, right? Yeah. And take that in on myself as an adult.
Fantasties.
Yeah,
I've started reading it and haven't finished it yet, but it was an interesting read. Now, he lost me in the beginning because there was no transition. You don't realize he goes right into fairies.
Yeah,
like fairies, not just like the fairy atmosphere, but it has the fairy atmosphere, but it goes right in. And I wasn't expecting it. I was
Tinkerbell world.
Yeah, I was expecting it to go from sort of like a Lewisian thing where it's like, oh, there's a wardrobe, and it was basically kind of like that, but then suddenly, like, oh, okay, we're just going to go with this now. Here we go. Okay. But yeah, so when Lewis read that, he said his imagination was baptized.
Yeah,
and I think that's important because we can apply these things so much to our life, and I think we do in a way that we're not. I think that was Lewis's. that was his critique in Abolition of Man, was be careful how you learn. Be careful what you let influence you, because that's going to come out. And if your theology, if you infuse it with good fairy and good myth, your theology is going to be better. And because he said, what did he say when they're like, he thought England was going to become pagan again. He's like, oh, it'd be great. Let's make them good pagans before we make them good Christians.
Yep.
And you're like, whoa. But there's something to the theology is poetry, the essay, where he talks about the poetic forms of theology and how we come about the beauty of theology and why we believe it. It's not poetry because it's poetic. It's poetry because it's beautiful and we believe it and we love it. And so therefore we relish it as poetry.
Yeah.
And I think all these things just make us better as humans. I think it helps human flourishing that I can read Lord of the Rings and go, even the tiniest insignificant people can have the greatest impact on the world. And that's one little lesson you can learn from it.
Yeah.
And that right there can stick with you as a child all throughout your life going, you can see Frodo as a person to emulate, or Aragorn, or any of the characters. You can look and see their qualities and know they did great exploits. And that encourages you. I can do great exploits because I saw their flaws. They all had flaws, but they went on to do this. And so we can draw from fiction.
That's the beauty of art, man, is it has no levels of accomplishment, that's truly there. I mean, we revere certain things, but, how many Van Goghs are truly out there that just never get discovered, I'm a big Pink Floyd fan, and I mean, you just watch their light shows and thousands upon thousands of people that gather to these things, and yet sometimes it's the gypsy playing a freaking banjo in the back of a dumpster room that manages to inspire you just as much or even far more than what they're able to do. And that's the way that these things should work. I mean, that's the way that art should work. And fantasy, for being, what Tolkien says is the greatest art, the most supreme level of art. It doesn't matter the size of the story, the popularity of the story. It matters what it does, what it can accomplish for you. And so,
awesome.
That's my thoughts, man.
Yeah, I think that's some good stuff. So I think maybe you and I could continue reading Tolkien if you want, and we'll get a little more, because we're going to be reading On Stories by
why we are made to do this. He really connects very much with Lewis's own. In fact, he quotes Lewis in this, but why we are made to actually make these things. And so it's a very myth becomes fact kind of thing that he pulls out there. So
I think we've got a good way to go. This is something that I'm so onto as trying to cultivate my own literary theory of how I see literature, what kind of literature that I want to produce. And this is just right up the alley of what I want to do. So
all right, nerd out on some fairy stories, man.
Absolutely. That sounds fantastic. So that's all we have for today. This is Wes Mullins from Drinkling's Roastery and Cafe in Wilmore, Kentucky.
I thought you go by Jack.